I'm here using my custom-made knife from Bright Forest Forge here out in the wilderness in my garage. I'm going to be doing a technique of hewing a fat spindle down to a skinny spindle. This is a spindle used for bow drill fire. It's hardwood, so I want a skinnier, shorter spindle. When you start with a fat, round spindle, you'd think all you have to do to get it narrower is just whittle off the end and just whittle around, turn it as you go. And you can do that, and you can eventually end up with a narrower diameter spindle. But there's a few problems with that. Each stroke is a little bit uncontrolled, so you have to do a lot of fixing. It's difficult to tell when you've gotten down exactly far enough in any one spot. You can end up with something that's not round in cross section, and it's difficult to get it of even diameter over the length of it. So there's this technique I've seen used in like Scandinavian log building, where they hack out basically stop cuts along the way. You cut it to a square, even though it starts out round and you want to end up round. You cut a flat surface. This is a flat surface that I've already cut. You can do that by whittling, or this technique that I'm going to be doing here. But you want a flat surface. I can tell that that is exactly straight. I can also tell that the side 90 degrees to one edge is pretty close to a right angle to that, and I can adjust that to where it's even very, very, very close to a right angle. Then I proceed around to the other two sides and I'll make it square in cross section. Then I'll knock off the corners, and what I'll end up with is first a square. It's very straight square cross section, very straight, very even thickness all over the length of the spindle of exactly the thickness I want. Then I knock off the square edges, end up with an octagon, round that off a little bit if I need to make it more round. If it sounds like more effort, it's actually less, because you're never cutting off any more than you would have to cut off anyway to get to the diameter you want. You take the square down to the size that you want, then make it round. It is the most efficient way to do it with the least amount of wasted effort. So here's two sides that I've cut flat. I haven't done that one. I can do it whittling like this. This is very hard wood, and I have not great control over the individual cuts. You can do it like that, and depending on the wood, depending on how it's catching the grain. You can also do this technique of almost like what you would do with an axe or a hatchet. Hack a bunch of hack cuts. And it looks a little rough at first, but those little stop cuts knock off very easy. You make a whole bunch of stop cuts and then whack them off. And that's very similar to what the Scandinavian log builders do when they're cutting a log to shape. They don't just cut freehand eyeball. They make stop cuts or stop chops through the wood and then knock off the stuff in between. And I can eyeball that to see that it's getting pretty close to a square cross section. It's a little bit off, so I nibble away at the edge that's too high. And I can also see that it's pretty dang straight. I'll have to work on that a little bit, and I'll nibble on that a little bit off camera so you don't have to watch the whole thing. Okay, now I've got 3 sides whittled down flat and fairly square in cross section. Hard to see that in the over the length of it, but it is. You can see the corners there. One more side to go there. I'll do a little bit of this, and it's not terribly difficult to line up a right angle to hack like this. I think it's called hewing when you hack it away like this. Whether you use this hewing technique or just whittle it away, you start with round, you trim it down to a square of the right dimension, then round it off again. Blacksmiths use a similar technique. I've seen blacksmiths take round stock, hammer it down to a square cross section of the size they want, then round it off again. I thought that was the silliest waste of effort until I understood why they were doing it. Because they can make a taper. If you want to make an even taper, it's a whole lot easier to do with a square cross section, and then knock off the corners to make it round again. And it's less effort and much more accurate than trying to go straight from round cross section to a smaller round cross section. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm getting down here and my edges are not, my third edge is not squared up with that at all. So I need to hew this a little bit at an angle. I'll hew it like that at an angle to knock that one off, and come back on that side to there. Do that too. Like that. So this knife from Black Forest Forge, I got it for Christmas. It was in progress at Christmas time. Has this beautiful, I don't know what you'd call, antique patina finish. And very simple handle. That little knob at the end really helps the grip a lot. It's a little, it's fat enough to have some weight for hewing like this, but not so fat that it's heavy and uncomfortable to use. So it's really good for this kind of light, random wood whittling kind of stuff that I do. And it's beautiful. That's from Bright Forest Forge. Did I mention that? That's kind of why I'm making this video, to kind of give them a shout out. All right, we got it pretty much cross section, pretty much straight. There's a few odd spots once again, and I'm going to spare you the details of me evening out those little rough spots. And then I'm going to cut to length, then round it off. Okay, I've got it about as square and straight as I'm going to get it. It's not perfect. I mean, if I spent more time with it, I probably could, but I would probably also make it a little bit smaller than I want. But that's pretty darn straight and reasonably square. I could probably go a little bit skinnier, but I'm just going to take it at this. Next I'm going to, actually, do I want to round it off first or cut it off first? It's easier to handle it with this extra length on, so I'm going to knock off the corners. So we have a square cross section, and then we go for the corners like that, and make stop cuts all the way up, and then knock off the bits in between. It doesn't take a whole lot to knock off the corners, and it's very easy to go overboard knocking off the corners, just a little bit, because we're gonna knock off that corner too. So you get that one and you get that one, and what's in between will be pretty close to the same. So it doesn't take very much time at all to knock off these corners. And with a little bit of weight in this knife, it really chops in there. It gets a good bite, takes off a good amount with each. With each whack. If I notice a high spot, I can make several little cuts there and knock them down like that. Already onto my fourth corner here, and then I have to get sort of the other end. I'm only done this one end. I was working on a piece of wood last week that had grain going just horrible directions that I didn't want to go. Trying to do long cuts like that, it was biting in and it wanted to cut across the wood. But by chopping like this and then knocking off the bits, I was able to make a straight cut, a straight spindle that didn't necessarily follow where that grain was wanting to take it. So I've done 4 corners here, but they're not quite as deep. I've got more space between the corners still, so I'm going to knock off the corners a bit more. You can see how much I've got there, and I've got there. I want to knock it off until, cut off the corners until the space between the corners is the same as that, and that will be an octagon cross section. I'll pause this and get back to you after I get that rounded off a bit more. Okay, I've finished knocking off the corners as much as I'm going to, really. It's not a perfect octagon, but it is very straight, very even thickness, very straight, and very even cross section, even if it's not perfectly round cross section. It's kind of an octagon cross section. You might find that that's as round as you need it. Sometimes you'll find old tools or homemade tools or hand tools that'll have sort of an octagon cross section because, well, you don't necessarily need it to be perfectly round. So I might round these off a little bit more before I get to using it, but now I'm going to chop that off. And I've made that stop cuts there already, and I'm just going to hack that a little bit more. I could use controlled cuts like this, but the hacking cuts seem to be working very efficiently right now, so depending on a softer wood, I might just whittle it like this. This is red oak, which, by the way, is not the greatest wood for bow drill fire. It's considered a difficult wood for bow drill fire, which is why I'm trying it. It's a challenge. Narrowing that down to a point, probably break off the last tiny bit and then form the point that I need. You can also use a very similar technique for getting an even point on the end of a stick. You cut it in a square cross section, kind of like a square chisel or something. Square that side. Let's see. square, flat surface there, flat surface there, flat surface front and back. So you have a square cross section. You can get it very even and an exact bevel with a centered square point, and then round it off. This, by the time I cut it across, was pretty close to where I wanted it, so I just rounded it off. I'm going to touch this up a little bit, then try the bow drill fire. Okay, I'm ready to give this a try. Bow drill fire using a red oak spindle on a red oak fireboard. I have not yet succeeded.